Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, unlovable animals that might just steal your heart, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Mike Hillman. It's a pleasure as always, Mike. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thanks, Kendall. Well, welcome again, everyone, to my presentation today. I've got a special place in my heart for all these unlovable animals, so I'm super stoked to be able to share them with you today. But to introduce myself first, I've been a guide with Natural Habitat Adventures now for a few years, working all across North America. I guide in Yellowstone, up in Churchill with the polar bears, over in Greenland, as well as in Alaska, in the Canyons area, and I'm looking forward to our spring season coming up in Florida. So I've spent a lot of time exploring lots of different parts of North America, and particularly my passion is with wildlife and nature in general, because I got my degree in zoology from Michigan State University. And there I started off my career working in zoos and aquariums as an educator as well as a zookeeper in places like the Fort Worth Zoo, the Shedd Aquarium, Disney's Animal Kingdom even. And I got a chance to experience either taking care of or talking about a lot of the unlovable animals that I'm going to be talking about today. And what I'm hoping with this presentation is be able to dispel some of the myths and misconceptions you may have about some of these creatures. And while I know I may not fully change your mind when it comes to what other animal you don't really like, but I'm hoping that you can appreciate them just a little bit more based off some of the benefits we get from them or some of the cool facts about them. So we're going to start off by talking about why we don't like some animals. What is it about some of these animals that just we could rather do without? And the first reason oftentimes has to do with disgust. And this is, oh, it's disgusting, it's gross, it's ew. And this all has to do with our evolutionary biology. So as a species, as we evolved and grew into humans that we know today, there were certainly a lot of different animals and a lot of different factors in the environment that we needed to stay away from because of health concerns. Things that are slimy or maybe riddled with disease, those sorts of things are things that as a species, if we stay away from them, that's much better off. Now, in today's world, we know, especially this year more than anything else, we know that a good hand washing routine can take care of a lot of these disgusting things that we needed to avoid back in the day when we couldn't wash our hands in the same way. We didn't have soap in the same way. And I know, especially as a zookeeper, I worked with a lot of disgusting things over the years, cleaning up after animals and whatnot. And just a good hand washing routine, get rid of all of that. And I don't have to have that feeling of disgust that you used to. In addition, we don't like animals that are pests. And in its base definition, a pest is an animal that is doing something that we don't want it to do. And maybe that's something as simple as a spider in our household that we'd rather not be in our household, or maybe a crop pest that is trying to eat up all of the farmer's land. We don't want them to do that. And oftentimes a pest is very much situational and it depends on the person, because we know as a nature travel company, traveling to places like Africa, going out and seeing things like elephants is an amazing experience and oftentimes once in a lifetime. But for the farmers and ranchers in parts of Africa where elephants can be found, they can very much be considered a pest because they raid those crop fields. And you can imagine what one elephant would do to a farm field over the course of a night while that farmer's sleeping. So definitely can be considered a pest to them, but certainly not to us. So it's very much situational. In addition to that, some of the reasons we don't like animals is because of the danger they may have or their perceived danger. Now, in some cases, it is very real danger, maybe a bit more of a dangerous predator, or if you're allergic to things like bee stings or something like that, that can be quite dangerous. But for more people on the planet, these are perceived dangers that aren't really real. That's why shows like Fear Factor was so popular, is because we perceive this danger of this woman being covered in bees. Is she going to survive? But the only reason these shows were able to do these types of moments is knowing full well that there really wasn't actually that much danger involved, as long as, of course, she wasn't allergic to bee stings. And this is the case when you think about that house spider again. I found this video online. It's fantastic because you wouldn't think that you could pet a spider, but it's certainly possible. I don't necessarily recommend it, but they don't have to be that dangerous as you might expect. And even things when I worked a lot with snakes in my zookeeping career, handling a lot of different types of snakes. And it can be quite safe, especially if it's a non-venomous species. They're just hanging out and using your arm as a tree limb. But that perception of danger can be used against you. This is a great little prank video. The guy in the red, the construction worker there, is dragging a fake snake behind him with a piece of fishing line and scaring quite well his coworkers. And this is all a perception of danger because the way that snake's moving in the video, it's not how it would move in real life. So it's pretty funny to watch, but it's certainly hijacking that perception of danger we have when it comes to animals like snakes and spiders. And finally, one of the big reasons that we don't like animals, or some animals in particular, is because it's learned. It's either a fear or in some cases a full-blown phobia. And a lot of this comes to how you notice other people reacting. So if you or someone around you reacts very negatively towards an animal in the area, you can imagine, say, like someone sees a mouse on the ground and then jumps on the table, and you don't know about the mouse initially. You're like, whoa, what's going on? And you can be quite scared. And that is a behavior that transfers back and forth. And again, when you think about things like primates and our evolutionary history, it makes a lot of sense because you want to know ahead of time and learn what other people are teaching you about some of the dangers that are out there in the environment. And no bigger connection is there than between the child and the parent. What the parent dislikes is oftentimes what the child is going to dislike as well. And while in some cases it can be actual physical reactions, either jumping on that table or running away from an animal that they're scared of, but it can also be just verbal things, like just using the word gross when talking about certain animals is a learned behavior. You're teaching your child to not like this animal because you're using that, or that animal is scary. And so while they may not have had a fear initially, now they do based off of that. And one I hear, unfortunately, when I was in the zookeeping world, and every once in a while when I'm guiding, is the only dead one, the only good one is a dead one. The only good snake is a dead snake. Those sorts of things. Those words, those phrases get transferred on to generation after generation, and we have this perpetuation of these stereotypes and this prejudice towards certain species. So the question is, how do we overcome something like this? And one of the things that we looked at, I looked at personally when I wanted to talk about overcoming some of these challenges, was a study was done of 260 children. This was just a few years ago, back in 2018. And they looked specifically at phobias of insects and arachnids, so spiders. And they wanted to know, okay, are kids scared of insects and spiders, and how severe is it? And by surveying these 260 children, they found that every single one of them, 100% of them, had some sort of fear or phobia. Majority of them were mild and some were moderate, but 5% of the children had a very severe phobia, meaning that it disrupted their daily lives, worrying about spiders or insects that may be in their area. And the study found that just by taking those children and teaching them a little bit more about the insects and spiders that are in their area and what dangers there really are or aren't when it comes to some of these species, they saw those numbers drop quite a bit. And so knowledge can be quite helpful in helping dispel some of these myths and misconceptions and get people to like them just a little bit more. And so that's what I'm going to do today, is teach you a little bit about some of these unlovable animals. And the way I want to do that is by taking you to what I call my island of misfit animals, or my island of unloved animals. You can see this little island right here that I've built, and there's some animals kind of scattered around. And we're going to zoom in and out of this island, going through these different species and getting a chance to learn a little bit more about them and hopefully give you some newfound appreciation for them at the same time. So let's get started with this guy right here, the vulture. Now, this is a species I've actually taken care of in zoos, handled several of them over the years, and it's a very cool species. But when we think about vultures, we already have a pretty big hurdle, because by definition, a vulture is a person who preys on or exploits the misfortune of others. So just the name in itself is already giving you that negative connotation when you think about the animal. So that's our first kind of hurdle we have to think about. Now, when we typically talk about vultures, we're actually talking about two different groups of birds separated by the Atlantic Ocean. In the Americas, we have vultures like our turkey vulture right here. And then out in Africa and Asia, we have these vultures like this griffin vulture here. And what's interesting, as kind of a side note, is they're not actually that closely related to each other. The vultures out in Africa and Asia are actually more closely related to hawks and eagles than they are related to the vultures we have in the Americas. And that actually is because they're doing what's called convergent evolution, where two different groups of birds have evolved to meet the same challenges because they're both scavenging out on the landscape. And so they have a lot of the same characteristics, but they're actually not as closely related as you might think. Now, one of the main reasons we don't like vultures is because they're associated with death, right? They're scavengers. You only see them around dead animals, dead bodies, those sorts of things. And so they are a species that thrives off of the death of other animals in the ecosystem. So there's that really negative connotation that's involved with that. But you'll oftentimes see them flying up in the sky. You've probably seen the circling, right? You've seen them lift up in the air, seen those vultures circling around. And what is the first thing that pops in your head? Oh, there must be something dead or dying nearby. The joke is always going, they must know something we don't know about what's about to happen to us. But it's not just vultures that circle, and it has nothing to do with them actually getting food or finding dead animals. What it has to do with is that vultures and other big birds that also circle, like hawks and eagles, it's very difficult for them to fly through the air because of their big, bulky size. And so that takes a lot of energy. And so the more they can use air currents to their advantage, the better it is for them. And so on a little idyllic landscape like we see right here, that hot sun is beating down on the grass, that's heating up the air towards the bottom of the grass right there. And that air, as we know, that hot air rises up. And so vultures will find these little air columns of rising hot air and take them like an elevator a little bit higher up in elevation. Then they can soar or glide until they find the next little thermal air column and then keep going up and down, and potentially traveling miles or more without ever having to actually flap their wings. They're just using these currents of air to get themselves a little bit further along. Now, in addition, when they are searching for their prey, or in this case, the food that they're going to eat, the scavenging, the carrion, how do they eat something that we consider quite disgusting? We wouldn't want to eat a 3-day-old cow carcass. We want our meat to be nice and fresh. And the reason they're able to eat it has to do with their stomach. They have the most acidic stomach of any animal in the animal kingdom. It's a pH level of less than 1, and that allows them to dissolve all of what we consider that disgusting meat and bone. And it's so acidic that it can even dissolve a lot of diseases. Things like botulism and cholera and anthrax. Those are things that the vulture makes quick work of. And so on these carcasses, they actually allows them to clean up the area. So if that animal were to have died because of some disease, we don't want all these other animals visiting, these other scavengers visiting, and then getting sick from that. The vulture can show up, eat a lot of the meat off that carcass, and then save or prevent infections of a lot of these other animals that may be in the area. Now, this particular picture was taken in India, and this is a domesticated cattle that had died out on the landscape. And about 20 years or so ago, India had a pretty significant problem with the vultures that were feeding on the carcasses of these dead cattle because the farmers were giving them diclofenac, which is an anti-inflammatory drug, which was, of course, helpful for our cattle, but it was actually poisonous to the vultures that were feeding on the carcasses. And so they saw between a 90 and 99% decrease in the vultures in the area, meaning that India almost lost all of its vultures because of this unfortunate cycle that was happening. And there was an unexpected side effect, is kind of like you saw in the last picture. The scavenger that took the place of the vulture were feral dogs that were living in the area. And because of that, they were transmitting a whole host of more rabies to the surrounding communities. And so when the vultures went down, rabies infections went up, which was a pretty significant health crisis that needed to be averted. Now, aside from just cleaning up a carcass that the vulture that can do, they also do another pretty interesting behavior. And that's, as you can tell, scientists like to basically name everything. And the process of a vulture going to the bathroom or urinating on its legs is called urohydrosis. That's your word of the day today. Try to use it in a sentence later today if you can. But urohydrosis, that process of the vultures urinating on their legs, while it sounds disgusting on the first glance, it helps them to cool down, because a lot of vultures are found in pretty tropical regions where they need to keep cool. But in addition, very similar to the acid in their stomach, the uric acid that they're excreting onto their legs is highly acidic and helps disinfect their legs, because they've been walking around in an animal carcass and leaving behind. But it also disinfects the soil. So just having the vulture around that carcass that may be diseased, just by going to the bathroom, urinating in and around that carcass, they're disinfecting the soil and preventing disease from getting into the dirt and then potentially into the watershed. So they are truly nature's cleanup crew. In addition, vultures have an absolutely excellent sense of smell. Depends on the species a little bit, but this turkey vulture is a prime example of that. You can actually see clear through its nostrils because it lets in as much air as possible to be able to smell quite well. And we as people have used this to our advantage, particularly gas pipeline workers. Natural gas by itself is actually odorless, but adding a compound like ethyl mercaptan to the gas pipeline gives it that kind of sulfury rotten egg smell that we're used to. So we know if there's a gas leak. And on a pipeline, that's super important to add so that as inspectors are going along, they could smell for those issues. But what they found is ethyl mercaptan is actually one of the active ingredients, so to speak, in a rotting carcass, and it attracts vultures as well. So with a gas pipeline leak, vultures, if they're hanging out near part of a pipeline, it's a very good chance that our workers will then go check that out and see if there was a leak somewhere, because it's been attracting vultures to that specific spot on the pipeline. In addition, in places like Africa, where poaching is a big deal, anti-poaching units know to look for large groups of vultures because they're obviously coming to a carcass, and a large number of vultures is typically attracted to a large carcass, like our big five animals like water buffalo or elephants or rhinos. And so they can use those vultures to find that carcass and hopefully do an investigation to be able to catch the poachers that were going after them. So those vultures are part of the anti-poaching units. But oftentimes, even though we have these benefits for them, they're still just a little bit ugly, right? They've got that wrinkly face, they don't have any feathers on it. But that is a pretty important adaptation for them, because they're feeding on these carcasses, they're reaching their head inside the animal's body cavity, getting meat and stuff out of it, and they would get blood and guts all over their feathers. It'd be very difficult to clean, and they could get diseased because of that. And some bird species don't have that unique adaptation. This is a giant petrel from Antarctica, which is a relative of the gulls. And you can imagine how long it's going to take that particular bird to get all that blood and guts off of its face, grooming, washing itself in order to be clean again. But the vultures don't have to do that. They're missing a lot of those feathers on the top of their head. In addition, like with the urohydrosis, another way they can keep cool is by actually venting off that heat from all that bare skin on their head. Just like us taking off our hat, letting some of that heat go off of our head. When we look at a thermal image of vultures, you can see how much heat is being lost by their head, which is allowing them to cool down in some pretty warm environments where they're often found. And besides that, I kind of think some vultures are pretty cool. This is an Egyptian vulture. They actually have yellow skin, which you don't see very often out there in the animal kingdom. And this guy right here, the white-headed vulture, has like a military-style crew cut. So there's some pretty interesting diversity. This is another cool one. This is a palm nut vulture, and they're actually, they don't have as much of a featherless head. There's only some bare patches of skin. They almost look more like a hawk or an eagle. Another one of my personal favorites is the king vulture. This is a species I actually got to work with as a zookeeper. They have this beautiful orange and red and purpley skin. It almost looks like a sunset over their head, which is quite cool. So probably one of my favorite vultures is the lammergeier, or bearded vulture. And this is a pretty cool species you find in parts of Africa and Asia. And one of the cool features of them is this is a nice clean looking individual right here, but they're known to essentially put on makeup to make themselves look even better and be a bit more dominant amongst the bearded vultures in the area. They'll fly over to a hillside that's covered in nice clay-like soils that are rich in iron oxides and rust, and they'll bathe in that with their feathers and stain their feathers this brilliant orange color. And the more orange and deep color that you get, the higher you are up on the totem pole when it comes to our vulture species, which is kind of cool. But what they're really known for is they eat bones. They'll grab a bone from a carcass, fly up in the air, drop it, and they're aiming for a bunch of rocks down on the ground. And as that bone hits the ground, it shatters into a bunch of pieces. Then they fly down, pick up that bone, swallow that piece of bone whole, and their excellent stomach acids dissolve all of the calcium in the bone, and they get that rich marrow inside. And that's the predominant part of their diet, is just feeding off of bones. So if you're in an area where lammergeiers live, you always have to be looking to the sky and making sure that there isn't a bone flying towards your head. But those and many other reasons is why I think that vultures are a pretty cool group of animals, and they definitely don't deserve the bad reputation that they get. Moving on to our next group of animals, one that's near and dear to my heart as well are bees. And that's because actually my first job in college was working for a honeybee research laboratory where we studied how bees communicated, what kind of foods they preferred, and how they navigated through their environment. So I did a lot of research working with bees, and I definitely fell in love with them. And bees get really a bad rap. A lot of people are super scared of bees for fear of getting stung. Now, if you are allergic to bee stings, that is a perfectly valid fear and something you have to be exceptionally careful of out in the environment. But by and large, a lot of people don't have to worry about bees as much as they do. And in particular, I learned that when I was at that bee job, that you can handle bees with your bare hand and you can be perfectly safe doing it. If they land on you, just gently picking them up with your hand and then setting them on a leaf or letting them fly away. Because when a bee is out in the environment, the only reason it would sting is because it's trying to protect itself. As long as you're not next to the hive, it has no reason to defend itself if you're not a threat to it, if it doesn't perceive you as a threat. So very much, I've done this quite a bit over the years where if a bee's landed on me, or when I was working in the zoo field, occasionally I would see bees land on children as they're walking around, and they'd get very scared and stiff and worried about that bee, and I would come over and just take my head gently, let that bee crawl on it, just like you would a ladybug, and then let it fly away. And that child oftentimes would look at me like I somehow have some superpower that I talk to bees. But it's just knowing that danger that really isn't as big of a deal as you might expect, just by letting those bees do what they want to do and let you go about your day as well. So really, when it comes to bees, beauty is in the eye of the beeholder. Now, one of the things I love talking about with bees is, unlike just about any other animal in the ecosystem, bees communicate by dancing. They literally do their language through dance. And so this is a little animation right here showing a figure-8 pattern that they're dancing in. And in the center of that figure-8, they're doing a waggle. This whole dance is called a waggle dance. And the orientation of that figure-8 and how long that particular waggle is orients to the sun and the direction of the hive, and that tells all those neighboring bees where a food source is. Here's another good video that might be a little bit easier to see. Down in the bottom right here, you'll see those bees moving around, and just by wiggling like that, they're able to tell all the neighboring bees where to find that flower that they were just feeding on, which is pretty cool. And the reason that they're doing this is because they are excellent pollinators. This great picture right here of a bee that's been pollinating some saguaro cactus in Arizona. And if you zoom in on the bee, you can see all these little dots all along the bee, and that's pollen. So as that bee visits one flower, then moves on to the next flower, moves on to the next flower, it pollinates all those different flowers, and that's how you get the new seeds. It starts a new generation of plants. And you might know this, if people have talked about bees before, you know that bees are great pollinators. And they're exceptionally good and exceptionally important to people, because 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we eat, actually we can thank a honeybee for that. They pollinate about 30% of the food that we grow and cultivate throughout the world. And here's just a bunch of different examples, from peaches and raspberries to pumpkins and tea and even coffee plants and almonds and tomatoes. And you actually have to thank bees if you enjoy cheese. This might be a little bit of a stretch if you don't think about the steps, but cheese, of course, comes from the dairy of cows, which eat alfalfa, which, you guessed it, get pollinated by bees. So we have bees to thank for cheese as well. So hopefully I convinced you that bees aren't necessarily as dangerous that you have to worry about them, and they have some unique benefits to them. But you might be like, okay, I like bees, but I don't know if I like wasps and hornets. I still move them over to the side. I don't like them that much. And they can be a little bit more aggressive. They can sting more frequently than a bee can. So it's potentially more of a danger than the bees. And they don't do nearly as much pollination as the bees do. So what are the benefits, and why should we like wasps? Well, the first thing is there are a lot of different types of wasps. So your typical one, that black and yellow one, but this is also a wasp on the screen here that's this beautiful metallic blue and metallic orange. There's actually 100,000 species of wasps. And to say what exactly is a wasp and isn't a wasp is kind of a hard thing, because when you look at the taxonomy, how they split up the family of wasps in Hermoptera, which you see up in the upper left corner right there, we categorize ants and bees and wasps as all being part of that group. And we know what ants are, we know what bees are, but wasps are basically anything that's not those two. As you can see right here, anything in the green is considered a wasp or a hornet, and then the ants and bees are kind of these little offshoots in the middle right there. But by and large, one of the things that you can use to identify a wasp versus a bee is they typically have this thin little waist, like you can see there between the arrows. And they're a lot less fuzzy than bees. This is a really cool picture showing a wasp on the left and a bumblebee on the right. And of course, the bumblebee, being an excellent pollinator, has a lot of these fuzzy hairs along its body, which collect a lot of pollen, so it can pollinate. And the wasp doesn't. It's not as effective a pollinator. It doesn't have all these ways to catch the pollen and move from plant to plant. But they also are an excellent pest control. They are a predator. They'll take, like that grasshopper right there, back to their hive where they'll feed their youngsters, so they can be pretty good pest control. But I bet you didn't realize that you can probably thank a wasp for your next glass of wine. And that is when you look at a nice vineyard, like you see in the picture here, these long rows of grapevines with the grapes growing on them. And the fermentation process that gives us wine actually starts while the grape is still on the vine. And it's because of this particular microorganism right here, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, otherwise known as brewer's yeast, that is on the outside of the grape. And that initial fermentation process is started by that brewer's yeast on the skin of the grape before they're even harvested and then barreled, and then continue that fermentation process before finally being bottled. And this brewer's yeast is very susceptible to cold. So when it becomes wintertime, either the grapes have been fully harvested or they're still on the vine, but they freeze and die. But also, so goes the brewer's yeast. It doesn't withstand the cold. But that grapevine, it needs that brewer's yeast every single year to able to give you the full flavor of wine that you're hoping for. And so how do we get this brewer's yeast on the grapes every year? Well, it has to do with wasps. A wasp loves to occasionally feed on these grapes and bite into them and get some of the juices off of these grapes. And when they come the previous season, they'll feed on some of these grapes. They take in some of that brewer's yeast into their stomach, and they fly back to their hive, they overwinter, and then the next year when the next crop of grapes come out, those wasps come back and re-inoculate, spreading that brewer's yeast all over the grapes, giving that nice fermented flavor that we love and need for our wine in our vineyards. So without wasps, we wouldn't have the types of wines that we have today. So I gotta say, next time you have a nice wine and cheese plate, you can basically thank a bee or a wasp for everything on the table, which is kind of cool to think about. So definitely, you may not want them around you, but they certainly serve an important place in the environment and a very significant place in agriculture. So let's zoom out of there, and we're going to move on to our next species, our next group of animals, the snakes. And snakes are an interesting case because we are hardwired, evolutionarily speaking, when scientists look at how we behave around snakes and how other animals behave around snakes, we are essentially hardwired to be fearful of them. We can't easily identify with them, right? They're this long, slender animal that moves in a very weird way compared to other animals. They don't have legs. They don't have arms. They can't even blink. and they don't have any fuzzy fur. They're this cool, scaly texture to them. So there's a lot of reasons why it's hard for us, evolutionarily speaking, to identify with something like a snake. And as I talk about snakes, if I already have this problem of evolution working against me, I'm going to hijack that system and try to use it in my favor, because like I said, we don't like snakes partly because they don't have arms, they don't look like people. So as I'm talking, I want to give my snake some arms, and maybe you can identify with them just a little bit more. So here are some pictures I found on the internet. It's a wonderful place where you can see all sorts of snakes with arms that can give them a personality, because they may actually have a personality like this, but it's hard to identify with that because we're not used to looking for the cues of why when a snake looks pensive or curious, or whether they like you or not. They can't hug in the same way. And so there's just some wonderful pictures on the internet of snakes with arms that hopefully will get you to think about snakes a little bit differently. I mean, who doesn't need a cobra playing a saxophone in their life? I don't know. And snakes very much are a helpful part of human society. We owe a lot to them because snakes are predator control. We certainly have to worry about rats and mice and overabundance of them. And just one medium-sized snake over the course of the year can eat 144 mice. And that's exactly how many mice are on the screen right here. So you can imagine if you have a snake somewhere in your backyard or nearby, how many mice less there are around just because that snake's slithering around. Now, of course, we have to worry about those venomous snakes, those snakes that can certainly harm us internally. And it's important to understand the venomous snakes that are in your area and how to identify them. Things like a diamondback rattlesnake, what to look for with that triangular shaped head, those little pits in front of the nose that help it to sense heat in the area. Of course, the rattle that it's known for. But there are species that look similar to them that in some cases are mimicking them because they want to be or kind of perpetuate that fear towards their potential predators. And that means that sometimes we persecute them because of that. Things like this fox snake right here looks superficially like a rattlesnake in that it has a similar kind of splotched pattern to them. And they actually will go as far as to rattle their tail, which doesn't have a rattle on it, but they'll wiggle their tail back and forth amongst the leaves that they're in, and it can sound like a rattlesnake. So just because you hear that sound doesn't mean you're dealing with a rattlesnake. So learning how to identify them is super important. Especially in places like the South, we get this coral snake, which is a relative of our cobras, and is venomous and certainly dangerous towards people. But you have the completely harmless milk snake, a relative of the king snakes, that goes with that black, white, and red pattern that looks a little bit different, but to the untrained eye looks exactly like a coral snake. And that milk snake might get persecuted just because it looks like a venomous snake. So it's important to know how to tell the difference between them. Now, even though we certainly have to worry about venomous snakes, the worry isn't that big, because when we look at the statistics, only about 1 in 37,000 people are bitten by a venomous snake every year. An even smaller amount, 1 in 50 million people, actually will die from that snake bite. So incredibly small amount. That actually means that you are 9 times more likely to get struck by lightning than you are to die from a venomous snake bite. So it helps put things in perspective just a little bit more. Certainly something to be aware of and teach yourself of, but the danger isn't as real as you think it is. Now, if you're worried about snakes in your yard or where your children or pets are playing, just do play a good defense. You know that snakes eat mice and rats. It's a big part of their diet. So if you remove those attractants, like keeping your pet food outside, or having a lot of brush and piled up boards and things like that in your backyard, which make great spots for mice and rats to hide. If you remove all that, keep it nice and clean, and keep the food out of the area, you reduce the number of rats and mice, which there in turn will reduce the amount of our snakes that may be in your area. So just play that good defense when it comes to if you're worried about snakes. And then you can hopefully enjoy snakes just a little bit more by looking at pictures of them online like I do. All right, moving on from snakes, we're going to go on to bats. Now, this is one that a lot of people are scared about, but I really enjoy bats. And kind of like vultures, we're talking about two different groups of bats. There are what's called the microbats, the small bats we're used to, particularly in North America. And you have the megabats, the larger bats. They're also known as fruit bats because they eat a lot of fruit, or they're also known as flying foxes because of that nice fox-like head that you see on this particular individual. And just like bees, bats are an important part of pollination. They're oftentimes pollinating a lot of the same crops that some bee species are. So they're super important for agriculture. And in particular, if you didn't like bats, you'd have to give up your next margarita, because bats are the primary pollinator of agave, which gets turned into tequila, which is the base ingredient for your margarita. So be thinking about bats next time you invite. And they're also incredibly important as pest control, even more than the wasps are. Scientists estimate that they do about $54 billion worth of pest control in the United States alone for our farm crops. So it's incredibly important that we have bats around to keep our food systems working the way they need to. But of course, what we're worried about with bats is rabies, right? You always hear about bats have rabies, you got to be very careful around them, don't want to get bit or anything like that. And they do carry rabies, but when we look at the World Health Organization, throughout the world, 99% of rabies infections are actually from dogs, from feral dogs. Now in the United States, we don't have to worry about feral dogs nearly as much as other parts of the world. And so bats are a species that can carry rabies, but not really in any more of a rabies prominence than we see in other species of wild animals like raccoons or what have you. In fact, only about 0.05% of bats have rabies on board as they're flying around. So it's an incredibly small amount of bats that actually carry rabies. And in addition to that, when we look at CDC website and they talk about bats, you can't get rabies from being around bat poop or from bat flying around or even just touching a bat. This is a picture from a pest control service holding a bat, and they have zero risk of getting rabies in that particular circumstance. You have to be bitten and get that saliva in your system to be able to contract rabies. So it's a very small vector of getting rabies from bats. So the worry isn't as big. But of course, people are worried about a bat getting in your hair. Just the idea of it getting stuck and not being able to get it out, getting scratched, you could get bitten in that circumstance. But I gotta say, this is actually a hair clip I found online on Etsy, which is just fantastic to have a little bat hair clip. But bats in hair is a pretty remote thing. It doesn't happen very often. And the reason for that is, one of the reasons we may not like bats is because they come in these weird shapes. Their faces look strange. This particular bat species right here, you have these long ears and ear structures, that weird leaf nose that actually allows the bat to collect sound. Because as you might know, bats echolocate. They help navigate during the night by sending out these high frequency sounds, listening for those echoes, and that helps zero in. And each of those little structures right there that look weird help them to better catch that sound and help them to better navigate. And so scientists have actually, in a research setting, in a completely dark room with absolutely no light whatsoever, they've put things as small as human hairs in a flight chamber and had that bat fly around, and every single time they were able to dodge something as small as just one strand of human hair because of that ability to echolocate and be as fine-tuned as they are. So if you're standing there and a bat's flying around, as long as you don't move very quickly back and forth, that bat can see you incredibly well and be able to fly around your hair absolutely no problem at all. Now, it may seem like that bat's hanging around your head quite a bit, like it wants to get caught in your hair, but more than likely what it's doing is your hair products, your natural oils and scent are attracting bugs. And so it's flying around your head trying to clean up some of those bugs that are bothering you. So if anything, the bat's a good thing because it's helping with that pest control in your immediate area. So as long as, if a bat's flying around, as long as you don't move very quickly, you can hang out and that bat's going to keep circling and not get stuck in your hair like you might think. Now, of course, people are worried about things like the vampire bat, the blood-sucking bat. There's only just 3 species of vampire bats, and they're not found in North America in particular. And even then, very rarely do they feed on people. They're almost exclusively feeding on mammals and other animals, particularly large mammals, things like cattle. And the way they feed is by taking those two little buck teeth right there, those little sharp incisors on the front. They make a small cut in the side of a goat or cow, and the blood slowly drips out and they lap it up, just like a dog lapping up water from its water bowl. And the way this blood is able to keep free flowing is because they have special compounds in their saliva, these special proteins that are anticoagulants. So that blood doesn't seize up and that wound starts healing. They can feed for a little bit before flying on. And scientists have looked at these special compounds, and in particular one of them that's very aptly named Draculin. It's a special protein that has these anticoagulant properties to it, which means there are potentially some medical advances when it comes to blood thinners, as well as even helping patients that are suffering from strokes by using a compound that's been derived from vampire bats' spit. So having these bats around and learning more about what they do is super important. And no more so than when we talk about things like coronavirus, with COVID and other potential infections and pandemics we could have in the future. Because when we had coronavirus coming out, people were starting to get very worried about potentially that the bats were the reason, where they were the vector that we have coronavirus going on. And understandably so, because bats actually on board, especially in tropical regions, going to have a lot of viruses and bacterias and things like that. And what's special about this is these bats don't typically get sick from these infections. The viruses and stuff are on board, but it's not hurting them in any way, shape, or form. So if we learn more about the immune system of bats and can replicate that in people, we could save ourselves from the next pandemic just by looking more at how bats operate, which is kind of cool. So with that in mind, I'm going to move on to our next species. Or actually talk a little bit more about bats as a group. We've got, they like to nest in these caves and are quite social. And they even share foods as well as keep nice and warm, which is super important. And they also are quite caring for their young. So even as much as, say, a cat or a dog, this particular mother fruit bat right here is grooming her youngster just like a young cat would do as well. And I just got to say, they're quite adorable as well. You can find lots of pictures of rehabbed bats online in Australia, where they do a lot of rehab with fruit bats, and the young fruit bats look absolutely adorable. So I encourage you to do a little bit of searching online if you're interested. So from there, we're going to move on to our next species. One of my absolutely personal favorites. This is another species that I took care of over the years, and that are opossums. And opossums get a bad rap. An early description of a possum could be something like resembling an oversized rat with coarse gray fur, a long hairless tail, and a toothy sneer and a long snout. And that doesn't lend itself to a lot of great things. And of course, they're also associated with our trash, right? They get into trash cans and things like that. And this is a species that actually is quite beneficial for people. They, in the garden, for instance, they eat any dead animals that may be lying around. They eat a lot of pests, things like slugs and snails and beetles, rodents. They'll eat fallen fruit from like your crab apple tree in your backyard, which can be very unsightly, and they'll even eat some spilled garbage around. So having a possum in your backyard is not a bad thing. A lot of people worry about rabies with them as well, like with bats, because when you first come upon a possum, you see a posture like this. Their teeth are snarling, their mouth is nice and wide, their hair is sticking out. But what's interesting is, based on their internal biology, opossums can't actually get rabies, or it's very, very rare, because their body temperature is so low that it doesn't harbor the rabies virus. And in fact, they actually help to reduce diseases in the area because opossums love to eat ticks. One opossum can eat upwards of 5,000 ticks in a season in your immediate area as they're moving around. So they're pretty important to have in your backyard. Now, you may see them from time to time doing this, what's called death feigning or playing possum. This is automatic response, where if the hissing doesn't work, their body automatically, without them deciding to, will seize up, paralyze, and then fall over. And then hopefully that predator doesn't want to touch a sick or dead animal and will move on. And that possum can get up in a few hours once its muscles start to relax, and it can move on throughout its day. And before we go any further, I just want to warn you, there's cuteness ahead, because opossums, I personally think, are quite cute. I worked with them a lot over the years in zoos, and they have a lot of personality to them. They can be quite adorable, and they can be quite good mothers. This is a mother opossum right here with all her youngsters that she's carrying around on top of her right there. And I gotta say, there are very few things that I personally think are more cute than watching a opossum eat fruit, in particular grapes. All that smacking noises that they make, they are quite adorable, in my opinion. And I'll leave you with this picture right here of a opossum that is on almost like a social influencer. This is a rehab opossum that has its own Instagram account. And so they can be quite adorable. I personally think even though they have a few more hairs than a cat, can be just as cute as a house cat in itself. So with that in mind, I'm gonna leave it there. So thanks so much for tuning into my webinar on some of the unlovable animals. And as I solicit some questions here, let me know if there's a species that I didn't talk about that you'd love to learn a little bit more about why you think you should enjoy them. Go ahead and put it in the comments, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more about them as we reach the top of the hour.
Great, thank you so much, Mike. That was fun. We've got some good questions for you, and I just want to remind everyone watching, if you have a question for Mike, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, we've got quite a few questions about vultures, so we'll start there.
Ooh, yeah.
How did India go about recognizing and fixing the problem of poisoning their vultures with that cattle drug? And how is the population now?
So the population is increasing, which is good news, but it's still, I mean, when you lose 99% of your vultures, you can imagine how long it's going to take to get some of those species back. And the way they recognized is they had to do a lot of research in figuring out, okay, what the exact problem was, because to start with, all they knew was the vultures were dying. It could have meant a whole host of factors, right? When we think about conservation, it could be the habitat itself. It could be either getting hunted or persecuted. It could be something behaviorally or disease that's going through them. And so they had to research and find a lot of these dead vultures, do necropsies and understand what's going on, do these kind of chemical markups of their blood to see what things are in there. And that's when they eventually honed in on this anti-inflammatory drug that people take, that we give to cattle as well, that is quite deadly to vultures. It has to do with their kidney failure, essentially. And so they figured all this out, and in India, they stopped using diclofenac with the cattle, but in some parts of the world, this is still getting used and is certainly a danger to the vultures in that area. But one of the things that they're doing in both India as well as other parts of the world, in places like Southern Africa, is they have what's called vulture restaurants. So if they know that that cattle is not going to have this compound in it that could potentially kill the vultures, and they want to get rid of that carcass, maybe even after like processing the meat or what have you, they can take it to a central spot, like a dump station that's just for livestock, and then the vultures come in. And if you add that carcass to the landscape, helps to promote vultures in the area. And then hopefully over the years, those vulture restaurants are going to up the population of vultures in India and other parts of the world as well.
Have poachers targeted vultures? You mentioned that the anti-poaching units often look for vultures to indicate where an animal is. Have they started targeting vultures that may give away any positions they have?
Unfortunately, yes. There is one particular instance of a poached elephant, I believe, that was laced with some very toxic chemicals. So after they took the tusks, then they laced the carcass with chemicals, so with the hopes that they would kill the vultures pretty quickly, and it wouldn't create this massive group of vultures that the anti-poaching units could see. And so that particular instance of that one elephant killed probably somewhere over 500 vultures and other scavengers that came to that carcass. So it's pretty unfortunate that happens, but it does happen.
Okay, and someone read that a turkey vulture was seen soaring at 20,000 feet. Can you comment on that?
You know, I don't know about that one specifically. That is quite high for something like a turkey vulture, but if they have the right air currents that are continuing upwards, it's certainly possible. The air is much thinner there, so they probably wouldn't want to stay there for very long because they're not designed for these high altitude flights like other species, like the geese that fly over the Himalayas. But it could be possible. I just don't know for sure.
Okay. So someone watching wants to know what the name of the snake was that you mentioned that mimics the rattlesnake.
Oh, that's a fox snake.
And quite a few people wanted to know actually if a yellow jacket is a wasp.
Ooh, yeah. So, like I said, it's very difficult to identify what's a wasp, what's a hornet, what's a yellow jacket. It's almost kind of like just different common names for the same group of animals. So a wasp and yellow jackets are related, and we just call some of those wasps yellow jackets rather than using like it's a yellow jacket wasp. We just call it yellow jacket.
Okay. All right, someone wants to know what is the safest way to remove a bat if it comes into your home?
Ooh. So really the safest way is to call pest control. Wildlife professionals in your area that can remove that's going to be the safest way to do that. You can potentially remove it on your own. The easiest thing to do is to open the doors and windows of the room that it's in and let it move out on its own. You can potentially use a net and then set that net outside and let that bat fly out on its own. But they're still giving yourself a bit of a risk of if you try to grab that bat with gloves or something like that, that it could potentially bite you, and then you would be at risk of a potential rabies infection. So always consulting the professionals is the best way to go when it comes to removing some of these pest species. And I always say, again, the best offense is a good defense in this circumstance. You can find ways to reduce bats getting in your house, looking around to make sure there aren't any holes outside of your attic or roofing, or leaving doors and windows wide open without any screening in them. Those are great ways to make sure you reduce bats, particularly in the kind of twilight hours. You don't want to open up your window without a screen as it gets dark, because you're going to attract bugs, which in turn will attract the bats into your house.
Great. We've got some good suggestions for additional animals to talk about, so let's move on to those.
Mm-hmm.
A couple people mentioned scorpions.
Yeah. So scorpions are certainly one that we can be somewhat careful around, and we need to be careful around them. Some people can be allergic to the stings of them, just like you would be with venoms from bees and wasps. But what's interesting is typically when people think of scorpions, they think of these big, massive scorpions. And oftentimes those species, the larger ones, like the emperor scorpion you find in places like Africa, those are the ones you would see on like Fear Factor, would be these big scorpions. And those ones, their sting is actually no worse than a bee sting. They're big, they have these big pinchers, and that's how they catch their food. They don't need this really highly venomous stinger because they're large enough to be able to overpower an animal that way. It's these smaller species of scorpions that we do have to be careful of moving around in the environment or getting potentially in your house. But they are, just like a lot of other predators out in the ecosystem, are an important link in this food chain. Some species of mammals feed almost exclusively on scorpions, and they are that link that allows that ecosystem to work as it is. One of the cool things I think about them, and something that you can potentially use if you're worried about scorpions around your house, is get a little UV flashlight. These get sold in pet stores if you're looking for like where your dog went to the bathroom and the carpet, you can't figure out where the spot is to clean it. UV flashlights work for that, but it also, UV makes scorpions actually glow in the dark. So if you turn off all the lights, you're walking around at night, and you're worried about stepping on a scorpion as you go to the fridge in the middle of the night, you can easily use a little UV flashlight and they'll light up like lime green yellow out on the ground if they're walking around. Or when you're hiking at night, you can do the same thing. So it's a pretty cool way to see them at night.
Yeah, that's very cool. Good advice. A couple of people want to know more about sharks.
Yeah, so I didn't get a chance to touch on sharks, but I can go through a few slides right here and talk about them in particular. So let's go back to our little island of misfit animals and zoom in on sharks in particular. And what's interesting about them is, move on to the next slide. We oftentimes think about them being this dangerous animal because they're in the unknown. They are in the deep blue. And we have all these negative media connotations. Jaws, when it came out, was just terrible for sharks' image out there in the world. And of course, anytime we see shark attacks in the news, like it's always, every single shark attack gets to the news. Not because it happens often. Things that happen often don't make news. Things that happen rarely are the things that typically make news. And so it's important to realize how rarely this happens. There's 500 different species of sharks. Only 3 species are really considered dangerous to people. And those are the 3 you might be familiar with: the great white shark, of course, tiger sharks, and bull sharks. Those are all 3 species that we can have in and around North America. But their attacks don't happen very often. In the United States alone, when we look at shark attacks, on average, only 1 person dies from shark attacks in the US every single year on average. Now, any guesses what you think kills 20 people a year? What other animal? Cows. So realistically, more people die from cow-related injuries, farmers, ranchers working and then getting hit by a steer or something like that happens. That happens more often than shark attacks in the United States. So put that in perspective a little bit when it comes to sharks. And as a little last aside, something I want to try to dispel is this term shark-infested waters. You hear this all the time in media, or like nature documentaries talk about shark-infested waters. And that's all this fear-mongering that you see. And you wouldn't use that in any other circumstance. You don't go to Yellowstone and see the bison out on the plains. And as a guide, I wouldn't be like, okay, now we're entering the bison-infested grasslands. It's where they live. And so using a term like that is very much just for fear-mongering. I mean, when we talk about bison or shark-infested waters, I mean, if anything's infesting the waters, maybe it's the beachgoers that are hanging out in the habitat that sharks have been in for millions of years. That's just my little soapbox when it comes to sharks, but it's certainly something I'd like to see change.
Yeah, great. All right, well, Mike, this was so fun. Such a great way to go into the weekend. I'm going to call it there with questions since it's the top of the hour, and I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining in for our Unlovable Animals. I really appreciate the fact that you may not like some of these animals, but you came with an open mind to learn a little bit more about why they're beneficial and why, while you may not want them in your house or in your backyard, you know how they fit into nature and how important that they are. So thanks so much again for joining us, and hopefully I'll see you again in a couple weeks talking about some more interesting creatures.
Yeah, thanks again, Mike. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. And I'd like to wish everyone a very happy early International Polar Bear Day. That's this weekend. So a very lovable animal.
Of course.
So be sure to join us on Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We have the current lineup for next week on our website, and keep an eye out for our Sunday e-news announcement as well. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have a replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Bye, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Bye.